The sheriff had spent years being the loudest man in every room until, one afternoon, his voice stopped mattering. In front of a small crowd, he mocked a quiet black veteran who didn't raise his tone, didn't argue, didn't even step back. Across the street, a gas station clerk kept watching, sensing something wasn't right. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's a warning. So why did the sheriff feel it too late? Asterisk, the town didn't look like the kind of place where anything serious ever happened. Quiet streets, familiar faces, and routines that rarely changed. People waved at each other without thinking, stopped in the same stores every morning, and trusted that nothing would ever disrupt the rhythm they had built over the years. It felt safe, predictable in a way that made people comfortable, and at the center of that comfort stood Sheriff Dalton. He was known by everyone, and more importantly, he made sure everyone knew him. His patrol car was a constant presence, slow and deliberate as it rolled through town, windows down just enough for him to be seen. He didn't just enforce the law, he performed it. Every stop, every conversation carried a tone that reminded people exactly who held authority. Most residents accepted it without question. Some even admired it. They said he kept things under control, that nothing slipped past him. But there were others quieter, voices who noticed something different. The way his tone shifted depending on who he spoke to. The way small situations turned into something heavier when he was involved. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, and on that particular afternoon, as the sun settled into its usual place above the street, something unfamiliar began to enter that carefully controlled world. He didn't arrive with noise, and he didn't try to be noticed. The man stepped out of an older pickup near the edge of the street, closing the door with a quiet, careful motion. His clothes were simple, worn but clean. Nothing about him asked for attention. If anything, he seemed to move in a way that avoided it. Measured steps, steady pace, eyes taking in the surroundings without lingering too long on any one thing. He walked past a few people who barely looked twice. To most, he was just another stranger passing through. But there was something in the way he carried himself that didn't quite match that assumption. His posture was relaxed, yet precise. His movements were calm, but never careless. He paused briefly near the sidewalk, as if orienting himself, then continued forward without hesitation. There were no signs of tension in him. No urgency. No attempt to prove anything, just quiet control. And that quiet stood in sharp contrast to everything the town was used to from across the street. A few eyes lingered a little longer than usual, not out of recognition, but curiosity. Something about him felt out of place, not wrong, just different. And as he moved further down the road, he unknowingly stepped into a line of sight that would turn that quiet moment into something else entirely. Sheriff Dalton had just stepped out of his vehicle when he noticed him. At first, it was nothing specific, just a glance in the direction of someone unfamiliar. But in a town where routine rarely changed, unfamiliar stood out. His eyes followed the man for a second longer than usual, narrowing slightly as if trying to place him and failing. The veteran kept walking, unaware or unconcerned. His pace didn't shift, his posture didn't tighten. He moved like he had somewhere to be, but no need to rush. Dalton leaned against the side of his patrol car, watching. There was something about the way the man carried himself that didn't sit right with him. Not because it was aggressive, but because it wasn't. No hesitation. No acknowledgement. No subtle deference that most people showed when they realized the sheriff was nearby. That absence didn't go unnoticed. A few people nearby sensed the shift before anything was said. Conversations softened. Movements slowed. The air changed in a way that was hard to explain, but easy to feel. Dalton straightened, his attention now fixed. The veteran stepped closer into his path without looking up. And in that quiet, almost invisible moment, the distance between them closed just enough for something unavoidable to begin. "Hey!" The word cut through the quiet without effort. The veteran stopped. Not abruptly, but with the same controlled pace he had been moving with. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the voice without fully facing it. Sheriff Dalton took a few slow steps forward. Boots firm against the pavement. Up close, his presence felt heavier, more deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. "You knew around here?" Dalton asked, though the question didn't sound like one. The veteran met his gaze calmly. "Just passing through." It was a simple answer, neutral, but something in the lack of explanation seemed to irritate Dalton more than if the man had stumbled through it. Passing through. Dalton repeated, glancing him over. "That's all?" There was a pause, thin but noticeable. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" He continued, voice tightening just slightly. The veteran didn't react. No defensiveness. No urgency to justify himself. Just taking care of something, he said at another simple answer. But again, not enough. Dalton exhaled through his nose. Shifting his stance, as if settling into something more official. Around them, a few people began to slow down, sensing the tone beneath the words, because this wasn't really a conversation anymore. And it wasn't about directions either. Dalton didn't step back. If anything, he moved closer, taking care of something. He repeated, louder this time, just enough for the words to carry beyond the two of them. A couple of people nearby slowed to a stop. Someone across the street turned fully to watch. "What kind of something?" he asked, tilting his head slightly like the answer was already wrong. The veteran remained still. "Personal." That single word hung in the air. Calm and contained, Dalton let out a short laugh. Not amused, performative. Personal, he echoed again. This time, looking around as if inviting the growing audience into the moment. "You hear that? He's got personal business." A few uneasy glances passed between onlookers. No one stepped in. Dalton circled slightly, forcing the veteran to turn if he wanted to keep facing him. It wasn't necessary. It was deliberate. "You got ID?" Dalton asked suddenly. The veteran reached into his pocket without hesitation. Handing it over with steady hands, Dalton took IT. But instead of looking at it immediately, he held it up for a second. Letting the silence stretch, more people had stopped now, and whatever this was. It was no longer private. Dalton finally glanced down at the ID. His expression barely changing as his eyes moved across it. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted not in respect, but in something closer to dismissal. "A veteran," he said aloud. Just loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. That supposed to mean something. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back lowered their phones slightly. Unsure whether to keep recording, Dalton looked back up at the man, holding the ID between two fingers like it carried no weight at all. "I've seen plenty of guys claim that," he continued. doesn't make you special around here." The veteran didn't respond. His face remained composed, eye steady, as if the words hadn't landed the way Dalton expected them to. That stillness seemed to irritate him more. Dalton gave a small, dismissive shake of his head and extended the ID back, but not directly. He let it hover for a second, forcing the man to reach for it. "Next time," Dalton added, voice edged with quiet authority, "try looking like you belong before you walk through my town." A brief silence followed. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, but something about it didn't sit right, and a few people watching began to feel it too. The veteran took his ID back without any visible reaction. No sharp movement. No anger in his face. No attempt to answer insult with insult. He simply slid the card into his pocket with the same steady care he had shown from the moment he stepped out of the truck. For a second, it seemed like he might walk away. Instead, he looked at Dalton fully for the first time. There was no fear in his expression. No challenge either. Just a calm, level stillness that felt strangely out of place in a moment built for humiliation. It was the kind of composure that didn't come from passivity. It came from control. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Sheriff," he said. His voice was low and even, almost quiet, but it carried. Not because he forced it to, because everyone had gone still enough to hear it. Dalton seemed to expect more. A defensive explanation. A flash of temper. Something he could push against. But none came. The veteran's restraint created its own kind of tension. It left Dalton standing there with nowhere immediate to go except further, and for the people watching. That calm became its own question, because a man who could stand in the center of public disrespect without breaking usually had a reason. He stood with the kind of discipline that most people wouldn't notice unless they had seen it before. His shoulders stayed loose, but never slouched. His breathing remained slow and measured, untouched by the pressure Dalton was trying to create. Even the way he positioned his feet suggested habit balanced. Grounded, prepared without appearing defensive. There were small details too. A faded line on one wrist where a watch had probably sat for years. The brief pause before he spoke, as if he had learned long ago that words mattered more when chosen carefully. The way his eyes moved once across the crowd. Not nervously, but with quiet awareness. Taking in exits, distances, faces. Nothing about him felt accidental. A clerk standing near the gas station window noticed the crease in the man's old jacket sleeve, sharp despite its age, and the careful way he carried himself made one thought linger. This wasn't ordinary calm. It was trained. The veteran didn't mention where he had served. He didn't offer rank, history, or explanation. He kept all of that locked behind a plain expression and a voice that never rose. And somehow, that silence made him seem larger, not smaller. Dalton noticed it too, but instead of reading it as strength, he mistook it for submission, and that misunderstanding pushed him one step further than he should have gone. Dalton's expression hardened in the silence, to him. The veteran's restraint didn't look like discipline. It looked like hesitation. Like the kind of quiet he had learned to exploit in people who didn't want trouble badly enough to resist him. And once he believed that the rest came easily, he took another step forward, closing the space again, forcing the moment to belong entirely to him. "You know what your problem is?" Dalton said, his tone no longer pretending to be casual. "You walk in here acting like you're above answering simple questions." The veteran said nothing. That only seemed to confirm Dalton's confidence. He glanced around at the people watching. Feeding off their attention now. See, that's how it starts. A little attitude, a little silence, like the rules don't apply. The words weren't really for the veteran anymore. They were for the crowd. A performance of control. Still, the man in front of him didn't flinch. No angry reply. No nervous backstep. Just that same unreadable calm. And for the first time, the scene began to feel wrong in a way even bystanders couldn't ignore. Because Dalton was getting louder, harsher, more certain, while the veteran remained still enough to make every escalation look uglier, and once that imbalance became visible, the moment stopped feeling routine and started feeling Dalton's patience. Thin to begin with, finally snapped into something more official. "Turn around," he said. The words landed hard in the quiet. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances, unsure whether they had heard him correctly. The veteran didn't move right away. Not out of defiance, more like he was giving Dalton a chance to hear himself. "On what grounds?" he asked calmly. That should have been a reasonable question. In Dalton's hands, it became an excuse. "On my grounds," Dalton said, stepping in closer. "You want to stand here and play games. I can make this a whole lot harder for you." His hand hovered near his belt, not drawing anything, just making sure the threat was visible. The veteran looked at him for a second, steady and unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned as instructed. No resistance. No struggle. And somehow that made it worse. Dalton placed a firm hand between the man's shoulders. More forceful than necessary, using the moment not to control the situation, but to display ownership of it. "This is what happens," he said loudly for everyone to hear, "when people forget how to cooperate." The veteran remained silent. But now the line had been crossed. And everyone watching knew. It got dangerous. The mood around the street changed all at once. What had started as quiet curiosity now felt heavier, harder to ignore. A woman near the pharmacy stopped walking entirely and raised her phone, pretending at first to check a message before clearly turning the camera toward the scene. Across the road, the gas station clerk stepped out from behind the counter and stood near the door, watching with growing unease. "Sheriff, what did he do?" Someone asked from the edge of the crowd. Dalton didn't answer, and another voice, older and less certain, spoke up. "He hasn't done anything." That only sharpened the tension. More phones appeared, held low at first, then higher once people realized they weren't the only ones recording. No one moved too close. But the distance between witness and participant had begun to close. The veteran stayed still, hands visible, posture controlled. Dalton glanced at the phones and seemed irritated, not cautious. If anything, he straightened further, as though being watched made him more determined to dominate the moment. "Back up," he snapped at the crowd. "This is police business." But it no longer felt private. And everyone knew it, because now there were eyes on him, and whether Dalton realized it or not. The story was no longer his alone to control. One of the bystanders took a cautious step forward. "Sheriff, that's enough," he said, voice tight with nerves. "You're making this worse." Dalton turned his head just enough to let the warning register, but not enough to take it seriously. "No," he said flatly. "What makes it worse is people who don't know when to stay out of it." He shoved the veteran a little more firmly toward the patrol car. Not enough to call it a strike. More than enough to make the point clear. The crowd reacted with a ripple of quiet disbelief. A woman lowered her phone only long enough to mutter, "This isn't right," before lifting it again. Someone else said they were calling county dispatch. Whether Dalton heard it or not, he gave no sign. That was the thing about power when it had gone unchecked for too long. It stopped recognizing warning signs. It mistook outrage for noise, evidence for inconvenience, witnesses for a nuisance that could be brushed aside. Dalton leaned the veteran against the hood and spoke, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You had a chance to answer simple questions. Now you can deal with the consequences." The veteran said nothing, but somewhere beyond the street, beyond the phones, beyond Dalton's control, the first serious call had. At the edge of the crowd, the gas station clerk kept staring at the veteran's face, trying to place something that felt just out of reach. It wasn't recognition in the ordinary sense. It was memory tugging at him from somewhere distant, an old news clip, maybe, or a framed photo he had once seen in a waiting room at the VA clinic where his brother used to go. Then it hit him, not the name, not yet, just the certainty that this man was not who Sheriff Dalton thought he was. The clerk stepped back inside, hands suddenly unsteady, and reached for the phone behind the counter. He didn't call a friend. He didn't call someone in town. He called his brother first, a retired army sergeant who had spent years around bases. "Ceremonies and names that mattered. I need you to look at something," he said, turning his phone toward the window where the veteran was still. Visible beside the patrol car, there was a pause on the line, then his brother's voice changed. "Don't hang up," he said quietly, "and don't let that video stop rolling." Outside, Dalton kept talking like nothing had changed, but inside that small gas station, the first thread had already been pulled. The call moved faster than anyone on that street would have guessed. The clerk's brother didn't waste time with speculation. He sent a screenshot to someone he trusted from his service years, an old contact now working on a nearby military installation. The message was simple. "Do you know who this is?" Less than a minute later, another reply came back. Not a full explanation, just a name, followed by one sentence. "If that's really him, this needs to be reported now." The contact forwarded the image again, this time through channels that did not run through town offices or county dispatch. A quiet verification request became a second call, then a third. Names were checked. Service history was pulled. Someone higher up asked where the footage was coming from. Someone else asked whether local law enforcement had been identified. No sirens sounded. No announcement was made. But behind the calm screen of ordinary communication, something had begun to shift. The kind of shift that starts invisibly, then arrives all at once. Back on Main Street, nothing looked different yet. The crowd was still gathered. The phones were still raised. And Sheriff Dalton, unaware of the chain now forming beyond his reach, kept behaving as if the whole situation still belonged to him. Dalton had no idea that his authority had already begun to expire. He stood beside the patrol car with the easy confidence of a man who had never been meaningfully challenged. The crowd irritated him, but it didn't frighten him. In his mind, this was still a local matter, still a scene he could control with volume, posture, and the badge on his chest. "You should have kept walking," he told the veteran, voice low enough to sound personal now. Like the humiliation itself mattered more than any accusation. The veteran remained silent. Dalton mistook that silence the same way he had from the start. He saw no danger in it, no warning, no sign that the balance had already begun to shift somewhere far beyond the town limits.
He glanced at the bystanders with open annoyance, then at the phones pointed his way. As if recording alone could never touch him. People see a uniform and think they know something, he muttered. They don't. That confidence might have held. If the world had stayed as small as Dalton. Needed it to be, but it hadn't, because while he was still talking like this would end on his terms. Confirmation was already moving through hands far more powerful than his, and by the time he realized who he had stopped, it would be too late. Inside the gas station. The clerk's brother finally said the name out loud, and once he did. The entire scene changed, the quiet man standing against. Sheriff Dalton's patrol car was not just a veteran passing through town. He was a highly decorated former military officer whose name carried weight far beyond service records and ceremony halls. Years earlier, he had led sensitive operations overseas, advised senior defense officials, and later worked in a role that placed him in direct contact with Pentagon leadership. He had spent a career in rooms where calm mattered more than noise, where one mistake could cost lives, and where discipline was not image. It was survival. That was why he hadn't reacted. That was why his stillness felt so different from fear. He wasn't a man being intimidated for the first time. He was a man who had spent years under pressures far greater than anything Sheriff Dalton could create on a roadside in a small town. Outside. Dalton kept talking, unaware, but among the few people now learning who the veteran really was. Disbelief gave way to something else, recognition, because this was no ordinary misunderstanding anymore. This was a sheriff publicly humiliating a man connected to a world far above his reach. The confirmation came in pieces, but each one made the situation worse. The image was matched first, then the service history, then a second official reached through a secure contact chain, verified that the man on the video was exactly who they feared he was. By then, the conversation had moved beyond curiosity and into urgency. This was no longer about whether the veteran had been mistreated. That much was already visible. The real concern now was where he stood in the broader network of military respect, federal relationships, and institutional accountability. A local deputy from another jurisdiction was quietly contacted. Then a senior official at the nearby installation. The language changed fast. Not look into this when possible. Not someone should review it later. Handle it now. Outside, the veteran remained composed, but the meaning of that had been completely redefined. He was not just enduring humiliation. He was standing in it with the discipline of a man who understood exactly how serious this would become once the right. People saw IT and now they had batuk on the street. Dalton still acted like the badge on his chest settled everything. He didn't know that the next vehicles arriving would not be there to support him. The video did not stay on Main Street for long. What began as a few shaky recordings in the hands of bystanders started moving outward with quiet speed. A text message became a forwarded clip. A forwarded clip became a call. Within minutes, people outside the town, people with no reason to care about Sheriff Dalton, but every reason to care about the man he had chosen to humiliate, were watching. At first, it spread through private channels, veterans, retired officers, people who recognized the name once it surfaced. Then it moved further, beyond personal networks and into places where reputations, conduct, and jurisdiction carried real weight. The tone changed with every step. This was no longer a local misunderstanding. This was an abuse of authority caught on camera, aimed at a man whose record demanded attention from people far above county law enforcement. Even some in the crowd began to sense it now. Phones buzzed. Expressions shifted. A whisper moved through the onlookers, subtle but unmistakable. He's not who Dalton thinks he is. And still Dalton stood there, unaware that the story had already left the town behind. Because somewhere on the road approaching Main Street, the first official vehicles had already begun moving in. The first vehicle didn't arrive with sirens. It came in fast, controlled, and quiet enough that most people only noticed when it turned onto Main Street and slowed near the crowd. Then a second followed behind it. Dark government plates. Clean lines. No local markings. The shift in the street was immediate. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered, then lifted again. Even the air seemed to tighten as two men stepped out in pressed uniforms, followed by another in a dark suit carrying himself. With the kind of authority that didn't need introduction, they didn't look at the crowd first. They looked straight at the veteran. One of the uniformed officials moved toward him with visible recognition, his expression changing from assessment to certainty in a single glance. The suited man spoke briefly into an earpiece, then walked forward with measured purpose, for the first time since the confrontation began. Sheriff Dalton stepped back instead of forward. No one had raised a voice. No one had made a scene, but the balance of power had changed so completely that everyone watching could feel it, because these weren't observers. They were people who had come with answers, with jurisdiction, and with no interest in Sheriff Dalton's version of events. Dalton's expression changed in stages. First, confusion. Then irritation. Then something colder. Quieter, an instinctive realization that whatever was happening no longer fit inside the rules he was used to controlling. One of the officials stopped beside the veteran and addressed him directly. Not like a suspect, not even like an ordinary citizen, but with immediate professional respect. That alone was enough to crack the scene wide open. Dalton straightened, trying to recover the ground he felt slipping beneath him. "What is this?" he asked, forcing authority back into his voice. "This is an active local investigation." But the words landed differently now. Smaller, thinner, the suited official turned toward him with a look that didn't carry anger so much as finality. Dalton saw it instantly. This was not someone impressed by county titles, public posture, or the familiar weight of his badge. For the first time, he looked past the crowd and noticed how many phones were still recording. How still the veteran remained. How quickly the atmosphere had turned against him. He opened his mouth like he meant to explain, to reshape the story before it hardened. But even he seemed to understand that the moment for that was already gone. And still, he tried. The suited official stepped forward first. "Sheriff Dalton," he said, voice calm and unhurried. "Step away from him, now." There was no room in the tone for confusion, debate, or pride. Just instruction. Dalton hesitated anyway. "I don't know who you think you are, but this man was being detained." "We know exactly who he is." The official interrupted, but stopped him. One of the uniformed officers moved beside the veteran and carefully removed Dalton's hold from the situation without force, as if even that small contact had already gone too far. Another official turned toward the phones in the crowd, taking in the witnesses, the angles, the evidence that had been gathering this whole time. Then the suited man faced Dalton again. "You initiated contact without cause. You escalated in public. You ignored witnesses. And you continued after multiple opportunities to stop." Each sentence landed heavier than the last. Dalton's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what was happening here." "No," the official said quietly. "You didn't." And in that moment, with the crowd silent and the veteran finally standing free of Dalton's reach, the sheriff's authority stopped feeling solid. It started feeling borrowed. The evidence came together with almost painful clarity. One by one, bystanders stepped forward and showed what they had recorded. Different angles, different distances, but the same pattern in every clip. Sheriff Dalton initiating contact. Sheriff Dalton crowding the veteran. Sheriff Dalton turning a simple exchange into a public display of power. There was no missing context strong enough to change what people were seeing. The gas station clerk spoke next, his voice unsteady but firm enough to matter. He described exactly what he had watched from the doorway. A woman near the pharmacy confirmed that the veteran had done nothing aggressive. Another witness repeated the question Dalton had ignored. What did he actually do? No one had a lawful answer. An official took notes while another reviewed the footage in real time, stopping at certain moments, replaying them, matching witness statements against what the camera showed. Each piece reinforced the last, and as the shape of the truth hardened in public, Dalton's earlier confidence began to look less like authority and more like recklessness, because now it wasn't one accusation. It was a record, visible, consistent, undeniable, and everyone standing. They understood the same thing at once. He was not talking his way out of this as the footage spread from phone to phone. Something else began surfacing with it. At first, it was quiet. A name mentioned under someone's breath. A memory shared between two people in the crowd. Then more voices followed. An older man near the curb, said Dalton, had stopped his nephew the same way the year before. No charge. No explanation, just a lesson in humiliation. A woman from the edge of town said her husband had filed a complaint that went nowhere. Another bystander muttered that everyone in town knew Dalton liked people who stayed silent, because silence made his version of events easier to protect. What had looked moments earlier like one bad encounter was starting to feel like part of a longer pattern that changed the atmosphere. Again, the anger in the crowd was no longer just for what had happened to the veteran. It was for everything people had seen before and never managed to prove. Old discomfort turned into present validation. The phones in people's hands were no longer just recording one incident. They were holding the first clear crack in a story that had lasted too long. The officials noticed the shift immediately, because when fear turns into testimony, accountability is never far behind. The decision was not delayed. After reviewing the footage, hearing the witnesses, and conferring in low, controlled voices, the officials reached the point where there was nothing left to debate. The evidence was to clear, the conduct to public, and the pattern forming around Dalton to serious to leave for later. The suited official turned to him first. Sheriff Dalton. He sighed. Effective immediately. You are to step back from this scene and surrender your weapon, pending formal review. For a moment. Dalton didn't move. It was the first time all afternoon that he looked truly uncertain. You can't do that out here. He sighed. But even now the force had gone out of his voice. One of the officers answered before the suited man had too. It's already being done. A second official stepped forward, calm but unmistakably prepared to enforce the order if needed. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent, as if no one wanted to interrupt the sound of power finally shifting in the right direction. Dalton looked at the veteran, then at the phones, then at the officials surrounding him, and in that brief silence, everyone watching understood the same thing. This was no longer about embarrassment. Now it was about consequences. Dalton's hand hovered near his belt for half a second, not in defiance, but in disbelief, like muscle memory had not yet caught up to what was happening. Then, under the steady gaze of officials who were clearly finished negotiating, he slowly unfastened his weapon and handed it over. No one in the crowd made a sound. A deputy from another jurisdiction stepped in too. formally relieve him of authority at the scene. Another official informed him that he was being suspended pending immediate investigation, with charges under review based on witness statements, recorded evidence, and abuse of power violations. Already documented in front of them, the words landed harder than handcuffs would have. Sheriff Dalton, the man who had spent years controlling the tone of every encounter, now stood silent while others decided what happened next. His badge, still pinned to his chest, no longer seemed to mean what it had an hour earlier. It looked small, ceremonial, almost temporary. He tried once to speak, to recover some part of the image he had built, but no one was listening to him anymore. And as he was escorted away from the centre of the street he had ruled with so much confidence, the town watched something rare unfold in plain sight. Power being taken back, the silence that followed felt different from all the others before. It had been the silence of hesitation, of people watching something wrong unfold and not knowing whether speaking would matter. Now it was the silence that comes after truth finally becomes visible. When no one has to pretend anymore, a few people lowered their phones and looked at each other with the same stunned recognition. They hadn't just witnessed one man being stopped. They had watched a story the town had been living with for years break open in a single afternoon. The older man near the curb shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in release. The woman from the pharmacy let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the moment Dalton first raised his voice. Even those who had once defended him looked unsettled now, forced to see his authority without the protection of habit. No one cheered. That made it feel more real, because this wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement. The truth had finally stepped into public view, and once it did, the town could not unsee it, and with Dalton gone from the centre of the moment, every eye began returning to the man who had endured it without breaking. The veteran adjusted his jacket, straightened slightly, and said nothing for a moment. He did not look after Dalton with satisfaction. He did not ask for an apology. He did not use the crowd, the cameras, or the sudden shift in power to reclaim the humiliation he had been put through. If anything, his calm seemed even more settled now, as though the outcome mattered less to him than the fact that the truth had finally reached the surface. One of the officials approached him with visible respect, offering a few quiet words the crowd couldn't hear. The veteran nodded once. C'est was all. No spie. No performance. No anger released at the perfect moment. And somehow that restraint left the deepest impression of all, because everyone watching understood what they were seeing now. Strength that did not need display. Dignity that had survived insult without becoming bitterness. A man who had every reason to make the moment personal and chose not to. The crowd didn't just respect him for enduring what happened. They respected him for refusing to become like the man who had tried to break him. And in that silence, the story stopped being only about punishment. It became about character. By evening, Main Street looked almost normal again. The crowd had dispersed. The patrol cars were gone. Storefront windows reflected the same quiet town they always had. But nothing about the place felt quite the same. Too much had been seen. Too much had been exposed in a span of minutes for anyone to return fully to the version of things they had carried that morning. What happened that day did more than remove one sheriff from one scene. It stripped away the illusion that authority is the same as character, that a badge can protect a person from the truth forever, or that public humiliation disappears if the wrong target stays quiet long enough. It also revealed something harder to forget: how quickly power can become cruelty when no one challenges it, and how powerful simple evidence can become once enough people are willing to look directly at what it shows. For the town, the consequences would continue long after the street. Empty.investigations.statements. Questions. People had avoided for years, but beneath all of that was one undeniable fact. The moment that exposed everything had already happened, and no one who witnessed it would ever see it the same way again. What made the moment unforgettable was not just that power was challenged. It was that power had been so certain of itself right up until the truth arrived. Sheriff Dalton believed he understood the man standing in front of him. He saw quiet and mistook it for weakness. He saw patience and assumed submission. He saw someone alone and thought that meant unprotected. What he never considered was that hidden truth does not disappear. Just because the powerful fail to recognize it, that is how abuse of power works so often. It depends on assumption, on habit, on the belief that dignity can be pushed aside without consequence if the target looks ordinary enough. But truth has its own timing. Sometimes it stays still while arrogance grows louder. Sometimes it waits while injustice makes itself visible. And sometimes, when the moment is right, it changes everything at once. That was the real lesson left behind on that street. Not that powerful people always fall quickly, but that power built on humiliation is weaker than it looks. And the people dismissed most easily are often the ones carrying the deepest strength. And once that truth is seen, the story can only end one way. Before leaving town, the veteran walked back to his truck the same way he had crossed the street that afternoon, quietly. Without hurry, without asking anyone to make room for him. The crowd had mostly thinned by then. But a few people remained. Some nodded as he passed. Some looked down, ashamed they had waited so long to speak. Others simply watched with the kind of respect that doesn't need words. Near the gas station door, the clerk who had made the first call gave him a small, uncertain look. The veteran paused just long enough to return it with a calm nod. A gesture so simple it carried more grace than any speech could have. Then he opened the truck door and stopped for a moment, glancing once at the street behind him, not proudly, not bitterly, just steadily, as if he understood something the town was only beginning to learn. That dignity does not get smaller when someone tries to humiliate it. If it survives, it becomes clearer. He got into the truck, started the engine, and drove away under the fading light, and after everything that had happened, the town was left with one final image, not the sheriff losing power, but the man he misjudged leaving with every bit of his still intact.